There's so little known about North Korea in the West, and not many people go there. Even very progressive people tend to know very little about the country. Therefore, it's very easy for the media and for human rights NGOs, which are actually in the pay of the National Endowment for Democracy or whoever, to spread, whatever lie you like. And I think that the DPRK often is a victim of, what Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, called the big lie, namely, the bigger the lie you tell, the more likely it is to be believed.
Hello, and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first part of the interview here on YouTube and the full episode on Patreon to watch for members for free. So please just become a member because we want to diversify our platforms just in case something happens to this channel. But also just know that if you make a donation, it will just go to covering our costs. Today, I have a very special guest, Keith Bennett. Keith is a British analyst, activist, and writer based in London. He serves as deputy chair of the Kim Il Sung Kim Jong Il Foundation. He is also the co-founder and an editor of Friends of Socialist China. Engaged with Korean affairs since the early 1980s, he has made numerous visits to the DPRK and written extensively on its struggle for sovereignty, self-reliance, and resistance to US imperialism. Welcome to Global Majority for Peace, Keith.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. You've had some amazing guests already on your program, so it's wonderful to follow in their footsteps.
Yes, I've had amazing guests, you included. So thank you so much for coming on. And really thank you for indulging me on this particular topic because I have very little knowledge on the DPRK, as most people really don't have much knowledge at all on North Korea. But we always like to begin each interview on a little bit of a personal note for us to get to know our interviewees and what were the origins of their politicization, how did they get to their worldview. And for you specifically, I was very interested to learn that you actually visited the DPRK for the first time in 1983. What led to that visit?
Right, well, there's obviously a backstory to that. I got interested in politics when I was pretty much in my early teens. So we're talking in the early part of the 1970s. For some reason, I was like more interested in what was going on around the world than perhaps the things that people of that age, in Britain at least, are normally interested in. I didn't have a family background in Asia or a family background in politics, so it was really off my back. But it was a time when, certainly for me, but also for many people around the world, exciting things were happening in China and in East Asia in general. The Vietnam War was going on and so on. And that's where my interest started. And my interest was overwhelmingly in China at that time. And China is, of course, still a huge area of interest and involvement for me. You mentioned just now that my involvement with Friends of Socialist China, for example. But I was interested not only in China, but the world around it. So, I was trying to follow what was happening in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, and also in Korea. And Korea was, very difficult to find things out about, but I managed to read whatever I could find. And I had that interest, but I think it really developed more in, if you like, the post-Mao period in China, because when China entered onto the period of reform and opening up, and it repudiated the Cultural Revolution and so on, a lot of people like me rejected Chinese socialism at that time. I didn't go down that road, but it forced me to think again about certain issues because I grown up really with their taking the standard Chinese view of the Soviet Union at the time, that it wasn't a socialist country, that it was social imperialist, and so on. And then after China had repudiated the Cultural Revolution and had begun reform, it seemed to me that the idea that the Soviet Union was not a socialist country, if I still considered China to be a socialist country as I did, that the idea that the Soviet Union was not a socialist country was actually not tenable, which wasn't to say that I therefore agreed with everything that the Soviet Union was doing or had done. And on that basis, I started to take more of an interest in the DPRK in North Korea, as alongside my interest in China and other socialist countries. And the things that interested me in the DPRK in particular were one, that through that very, very difficult period of the split between the Soviet Union and China, the DPRK had managed to maintain basically good relations with both of those two great large socialist powers, which was almost unique. Secondly, that at that time the DPRK appeared to have well, indeed did have a very good success story in socialist construction and in building up their country from the ruins of war. People talk about the Korean miracle, and it's nearly always associated with South Korea. Very few people know that it was the very distinguished British economist Joan Robinson who first coined the phrase Korean miracle to describe what she saw on her visit to Pyongyang in the early 1960s. That's the origin of the phrase. So at that time, in the early 1980s and so on, the DPRK had a much higher standard of living than South Korea. It had a higher standard of living than China. So it was clear to me that they'd done something right in their own socialist construction. And thirdly, the DPRK had a very strong anti-imperialist standpoint in its foreign policy. So although it kept good relations with both the Soviet Union and China, it wasn't necessarily following their same foreign policy models when the Soviet Union was trying to calm down national liberation movements in parts of the global south in order to preserve détente and so on. The DPRK wasn't going down that road. The DPRK was consistently supporting national liberation movements in Africa, revolutionary movements in Latin America, and so on. In many ways, as the Cubans were doing, it was a very similar international policy on that level to the one that the Cubans were pursuing. A key difference would be that the Cuban example is much better known in the West than the DPRK one is. And so it was all these things that led me to take more and more of an interest in Korea and wanted to reach out to them to establish some kind of relationship with them, which wasn't actually very easy because at that time the British government refused any kind of diplomatic relations with the DPRK, and they very, very rarely would they issue visas for DPRK citizens to come to Britain. So there was no DPRK representation. I tried in my first visit to China in 1981 to make contact with them. I didn't succeed at that time, but I was able in 1982 to establish relations with the nearest DPRK diplomats who were based in Paris. France didn't have diplomatic relations with the DPRK. In fact, it still doesn't have full diplomatic relations with the DPRK, but there was a Korean mission to UNESCO in Paris, and that's the people that I and a couple of people I was working with were able to make contact with. That time we set up a body called the Korea Friendship Committee, which got the support of some left Labour MPs and other people, which was very good. And out of that, I was also at that time editing a left-wing newspaper. And in 1983, the Koreans jointly organized with the International Organization of Journalists, which was a progressive organization based in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, which obviously was a socialist country at that time. They organized something called the World Conference of Journalists Against Imperialism and for Independence and Peace. And they had people from probably about 100 countries around the world were involved in that, but they invited me as the editor of a left-wing newspaper in Britain to attend that conference. And that was the first opportunity that I had to go to the DPRK, and it was the first of very many.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting and pretty amazing, I think. Like you said, so many people abandoned China's socialism at the time instead of exploring and trying to figure out what happened and the path forward. So that's really commendable that you continued your exploration into North Korea. But you mentioned Cuba as well. And one of the things that I'm really kind of realizing is how much North Korea is demonized in a way that even Cuba isn't demonized. I feel like if we look at some of the core allegations against it, it's like clearly one of the most prominent victims of US propaganda. But it seems like their core allegations are either clear misinformation or the direct result of draconian sanctions imposed by the West. Can we systematically debunk some of the major ones? Because I think the two ones that really stand out to me are the idea that North Korea is particularly unique in their grave human rights violations. In fact, so unique that they warrant being draconianly sanctioned the way that they are. And the other reason that they need to be sanctioned is because apparently they are purposefully starving their population because of prioritizing their nuclear program. So, can you help unpack where this is coming from? Why is it even so successful? And what's actually the reality behind it?
Right. I'm not sure how systematic I can be in answering that, but let me make some observations about this. The first thing I would say is that if you look at Korean history, up until 1945, Korea was a colony of Japan. And at that time, the people in Korea had basically no human rights whatsoever. They didn't even have the right to have Korean names or to use the Korean language. The Japanese colonialism was of a type that tried to, systematically stamp out any manifestation of Korean nationhood or Korean culture. So, there were no human rights to speak of. And furthermore, throughout the history of the Republic of Korea, in the south of Korea, you have huge violations of human rights. South Korea, for the most of its existence as a state, has been a military dictatorship. Political prisoners were kept there for decades, over 40 years. People served in solitary confinement much longer than the term of imprisonment that everyone knows about, for example, like of Nelson Mandela. And, they were held in prison on purely ideological grounds for refusing to renounce communism or trumped up charges and so on. And we saw just about a year ago the incumbent South Korean president at that time tried to stage a coup and suppress democracy. So there's a history of human rights questions on the Korean Peninsula going up to today, which means that you can't just look at the DPRK in isolation. Now, to go further on this, if you look at the history of the DPRK, when Korea was liberated in 1945, and because of the agreements between the great powers, it was a kind of Soviet zone in the north and an American zone in the south, which was intended to be a temporary arrangement, but these things have a habit of becoming somewhat permanent. The first factory that was built in North Korea after liberation was a pencil factory in order to promote education, to teach people how to read and write. The very first law that was passed was the law on equality of men and women. Other subsequent laws that followed very rapidly from that were on land reform and on the nationalization of major industries. So if you look at the question of social rights in North Korea, you have completely free education from kindergarten and nursery through to PhD level or postdoctoral research at university. There's completely free education, and that includes also free school uniforms, free school bags, free textbooks, and so on. Medical care is completely free, not just care in hospital, but there's no 10 or 11 pound charge for your prescriptions, medicines, any type of medical care is completely free. There's full employment. North Korea is practically the only country in the world. Venezuela has tried to do this to a certain extent with their program, but in a systematic way, covering really the whole of the population. North Korea is the only country in the world where homes are provided to people free of charge. When I was in Korea in April, they've had a program of building 50,000 new homes in the capital, Pyongyang, and the final street was completed and officially opened while we were there. And these streets are like whole communities with new flats, but also with restaurants, with shops, with bars, with cultural facilities, with green space, and so on. And these are provided to people totally free of charge, no mortgage, no rent. So which is perhaps hard to imagine. So on these social, on the questions of the human rights that I would say are most important to the majority of people in the world, these are the things that are the fundamentals of what makes a decent life, then I would say that the North Korean human rights record actually is extremely good. And it's precisely because it is good on that level, I would argue that there is such an attempt made to demonize it. Does that mean that there are no issues of human rights in North Korea? I personally wouldn't say that. I know that there are some friends of the DPRK that do. I don't think that's right. I was there again this year. I've been twice this year. I was there this year in October when there was a celebration of the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party of Korea, the ruling party there, the Communist Party there. And Kim Jong-un, the country's leader, made several speeches. He said that the party, particularly with the passing of time and the change of generation, had to be very vigilant against any tendencies towards the emergence of what he called authoritarianism, which would alienate the party from the people and discredit the ideas of socialism. So, like every country, there are issues and problems that can arise. But I thought it was very interesting that the leader of the country himself made a point of drawing attention to them and actually calling for vigilance and struggle against them. It's also, of course, the case that the DPRK is a country at war. I know that sounds a little bit melodramatic, perhaps, but in 1953, the Korean War was fought from June 1950 to July 1953. In 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. Now, an armistice agreement is not the same as a peace treaty. So there's no peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula. And in fact, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, actually refused and refused to this day to sign even the armistice agreement. The United States is still occupying South Korea with numerous military bases, tens of thousands of troops, and so on. And the United States has repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea. So, in any country in the world faced with those kinds of threats is obviously going to pay a great deal of attention to internal security. So, I think that's one point. I think, first of all, because there's so little known about North Korea in the West and not many people go there, therefore, as you said in your introduction, even very progressive people tend to know very little about the country. Therefore, it's very easy for the media and for human rights NGOs, which are actually in the pay of the National Endowment for Democracy or whoever, to spread, whatever lie you like. And I think that the DPRK often is a victim of, what Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, called the big lie, namely, the bigger the lie you tell, the more likely it is to be believed. It's a bit like the charges that China faces of so-called genocide in Xinjiang. If you accuse your opponent of the worst possible thing that you can imagine, so we'll have a situation of people say, oh, there's a genocide in Xinjiang. And you say, well, what's your evidence for that? And the answer is, so you support genocide, do you? You just make the allegation so extreme that even to question it makes you a bad person. And I think the DPRK has been the victim of that for a long time. And you have another source of this kind of propaganda against the DPRK is some of the defectors who've gone to South Korea. Now, first of all, the defectors that go to South Korea are put under extreme pressure to come up with these stories. And there's one particular person, people can look him up on the internet, Shin Dong-hyuk, who became the most, if you like, the most celebrity defector of North Korea. And he had a ghostwritten book written for him really by an American journalist called Escape from Camp 14. And he got onto this speaking tour. He's spoken in the British Parliament some years ago, and he claims to have been born in a prison camp and to have seen executions and been tortured and so on. And gradually his story started to fall apart. He said his father was dead. His father turned out to be very much alive, and so on. And even the person who wrote his book ended up kind of quite embarrassed by the number of falsehoods that were clearly contained there. But the issue is that the expose of these kind of things never gets anything like the same publicity as the original accusation. People who've usually they've gone across the border to China, which is not normally very heavily guarded because the two countries are friendly, and then have made their way to South Korea. And people have gone for different reasons, and sometimes because of economic difficulties that the North has gone through, misinformation that's come that if you go to South Korea, you'll have a much more prosperous life and so on. What they actually find, many of them, those who don't become the celebrity defectors, if you like, what they actually find is that they're the targets of prejudice and discrimination in the South. They become, the poorest workers, and suddenly discover that they don't have all the social rights that they had in the North, that they're having to work 18-hour days for a room to live in, and so on. And what's again rarely reported in the West is the number of those people who say that they made such a mistake in leaving the North and would like to go back, would like to return home, and are actually prevented by the South Korean authorities from doing so. So just moving on to what you're saying about the nuclear issue. First of all, it's undoubtedly true. Well, nuclear weapons programs, even no matter how your economy is structured, nuclear weapons programs are very expensive. And obviously, it was not easy for North Korea to do this as a relatively small country under very heavy international sanctions to actually self-reliantly and independently do that would required a lot of sacrifice. And I don't see any point in denying that. But to actually sacrifice in order to do something that you see as essential for your security can't be considered to be a deliberate act of starving your own people. Otherwise, we would have to say that, for example, the rationing that people endured in Britain during the Second World War, when this country was fighting the Nazis, was an act of the British government starving its own people. I mean, Churchill was perfectly capable of starving other people, like in Bengal, but it isn't a charge that holds water if you apply it to Britain. And of course, the stories of supposed starvation or famine in North Korea were greatly exaggerated for the kind of reasons that have just been mentioned. Again, North Korea doesn't deny that it went through an extremely difficult period at that time. It's what they called the arduous march, but there were various reasons for that. There were successive waves for several years running of natural disasters, of floods, of droughts, cyclones, and so on, which played havoc with the harvests. And again, North Korea is an 80% mountainous country. It's actually very rich in mineral resources, but its agricultural land is very limited. And it was also suffering at the time. The United States chose that time to tighten their sanctions, which had been in place for decades, but to tighten them even further. And at that time, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and that nowadays, once again, DPRK and Russia have an excellent and ever closer relationship. But at that time, the immediate post-Soviet regime in Russia was very much keeping North Korea at arm's length. So North Korea lost so much of its international trade. Some of the chemical inputs that they relied on to produce fertilizer to make maximum use of what agricultural land they did have became choked off. So there was like a perfect storm of issues, which certainly can't be just reduced to the nuclear program.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting how we can see echoes of that in China as well with the Great Leap Forward. A huge part of the starvation or the famine is caused by Western sanctions, which is always sort of overlooked when talking about these periods in these countries. one of the things that I always hear about North Korea is when you mention the US sanctions, people will say, well, the US provided aid to North Korea at that time. But it's like you create the conditions for just extreme struggle and difficulty, and then you give a little bit of aid, and that's supposed to cancel out all the harm that you've done. I mean, I think that's one of the enduring myths of, North Korea, again, during that time. Because actually, when I was doing research about this, I realized that the DPRK has endured some of the harsher sanctions in modern history. Now, of course, currently we will have Iran and Russia that has bigger volumes of sanctions at the moment levied against them. But what's sort of unique about North Korean sanctions are that they're multilateral with binding UN resolutions, which means that even countries with strong diplomatic ties with them, like China and Russia, have been historically formally obligated to enforce these restrictions. Can you help us understand really the well, I guess one thing is how were they able to survive and adapt considering how draconian these sanctions were? And the other thing is historically, China and Russia were made to sort of abide by these restrictions to a certain degree. But how has that changed, if any, in recent years?
First of all, I thought you made a very good point about you try to starve people and then you provide a kind of a drip feed of aid. And I think that's very important. Actually, some of the aid that did come to the DPRK in that time was through the UN World Food Programme, which so it wasn't really a bilateral thing. But what the United States committed to was at the beginning of the 1990s, the tensions on the nuclear issue became very acute, and there was a real danger that Clinton was going to launch a war against the DPRK. And that's when the former president, Jimmy Carter, took it upon himself to go on an unauthorized diplomatic mission and really present a fait accompli of announcing that he'd made an agreement with Kim Il Sung on American television because CNN went with him. That then became the what was called the Agreed Framework, which was signed by the United States and North Korea in Geneva in October 1994. Now, according to that, North Korea was supposed to suspend its nuclear program. And in return, the United States would create an international consortium to build two light water reactors in the DPRK to help them solve the energy issues that they had. And in the meantime, the United States would supply fuel aid to the DPRK. What they did was they didn't really begin the work of building the light water reactors. And then they supplied this fuel aid much less than they committed to and in dribs and drabs because it was constantly subject to back and forth in Congress with so it was a Democrat administration at that time, so the Republicans were opposing it and so on. And later on, the United States admitted that they only committed to this because they actually thought that the government in the DPRK was going to collapse in the post-Soviet world and that they would never actually have to go through with it, which is a bit like what's now come out about the Minsk agreement with regard to the Ukraine situation. This idea that you actually enter into an agreement on your own understanding that you're never actually going to have to implement it. And with regard to the sanctions on the DPRK, yes, of course, it's true that recently in Iran and even more recently in Russia, you had this huge pile on of sanctions very, very quickly. But I think some of the difference is that in the DPRK has been the subject of sanctions for decades. So again, the blockade of Cuba is relatively well known, at least among progressive people, it's well known, certainly. The fact that the DPRK has been subject to similar sanctions from the United States for actually longer even than Cuba is not well known. So the DPRK is the victim of, a whole number of sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council, but there's also sanctions of imposed by the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, and so on, which go beyond the UN Security Council resolutions. There's also, I like to say this, there's always sanctions and there's the perception of sanctions. So even when things are allowed by the sanctions, you find that government, countries, businesses, and so on are very reluctant to do it because of what they see as reputational risk, or that they will have a backlash of some kind, or they just imagine that it's impossible to do any kind of business. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, if you like. So obviously, this has caused a lot of hardship and a lot of difficulty for the DPRK, as it would for any country. Russia has done, of course, extraordinarily well under sanctions, but Russia is a huge country with all types of resources and so on. But how has the DPRK been able to cope with this? I think the main reason, I think, goes back to the very ideology that prevails in the DPRK. It's what Kim Il-sung called the Juche idea, which really stresses that the country has to be based on independence and self-reliance and so on. So the DPRK has always had, I mean, it's always been open to cooperation, economic cooperation, and so on with other countries. But it's always stressed that it didn't want to be dependent on that. For example, in the period of the Soviet Union, there was something called Comecon, stands for the Council of Mutual Economic Cooperation. Anyway, may have got that slightly wrong, but it was a kind of socialist countries' common market led by the Soviet Union, which the East European countries belonged to, Mongolia belonged to, later Vietnam was admitted to it, and so on. And the Soviet Union wanted the DPRK to join Comecon, and the DPRK always refused because they didn't want to be dependent on any other country. And when a friend of mine met Kim Il sung, and Kim Il sung retold this story that Khrushchev had said to him, why are you building your own power plants? We have so much power in Siberia, we can just supply it to you. And Kim Il sung replied that, electricity power was like played the role in the national economy that the heart plays in a human body. It is the heart that pumps the blood around and keeps you alive. It says, if I become dependent on you, if one day I upset you and you turn off the power, then we'll die. So I think he was very far-sighted in this regard. So always they had this idea of building an independent national economy, and they've used their own resources to build what they have. And in that sense, they very much can be seen as a model for other developing countries, which countries even like, for example, Burkina Faso at the moment is now looking at how does it develop so that it doesn't just export raw materials, but builds processing facilities and so on. And I think this is the key reason. And also because the political work of the Workers' Party in Korea, that people are actually mobilized to build the country themselves.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.